Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Science Society. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Perhaps you've had a long day filled with questions, or maybe you're the kind of person who likes to drift off while pondering the grand mysteries of life itself. Either way, you're in the right place. Tonight's journey is special because we're going to explore one of the most profound ideas humanity has ever conceived. An idea so elegant, so powerful, that it fundamentally changed how we understand ourselves and every living thing on Earth. You've got nothing to do but rest. Let your shoulders drop, your breathing slow, and your mind gently open to wonder. Because tonight, we're going to follow the story of Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution by natural selection. It's a story that spans the continents and decades, from the volcanic shores of remote islands to the quiet study of an English country house. It's about finches and fossils, about struggle and survival, about the delicate threads that connect all living things across the vast reaches of time. This isn't just a story about science, it's a story about curiosity, courage, and the patience to observe the world with fresh eyes. It's about a young man who boarded a ship with few expectations and returned with questions that would echo through the centuries. And before we begin our journey tonight, if you find these gentle explorations help you unwind or give you a peaceful way to end your day, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps other curious minds find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. So settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin at the beginning. Let's start with a young man in England, long before he became the Darwin we know today, when he was simply Charles, uncertain of his path, unaware that he would one day reshape humanity's understanding of life itself. The young Darwin, before the Revolution. Charles Robert Darwin was born on February 12, 1809, in the market town of Shrewsbury, England. The world he entered was one of certainty, at least on the surface. Most educated people believed that species were fixed and unchanging, created in their current forms by divine will. The earth itself was thought to be perhaps 6,000 years old, no more. The hierarchy of nature was clear, ordained, and permanent. Into this world of certainty came a boy who would learn to question everything. He was born into privilege and intellectual heritage. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had been a prominent physician and natural philosopher who had actually written about evolutionary ideas decades before Charles was born. In his work, Zoonomia, Erasmus proposed that all warm-blooded animals arose from a single living filament. These were radical ideas for the time, though they lacked the mechanism that would later make evolution comprehensible. Young Charles grew up hearing stories of his famous grandfather, though Erasmus had died 7 years before Charles was born. Still, the family legacy of curiosity and free thinking was there, woven into the fabric of his upbringing. Charles's father, Robert Darwin, was a successful and wealthy physician, a large man in both stature and reputation, weighing over 300 pounds and standing over 6 feet tall. He was intimidating, practical, and deeply invested in his children's futures. Charles's mother, Susanna, died when he was only 8 years old, leaving a void that shaped his childhood. He was sent to boarding school at Shrewsbury School, where he showed little aptitude for the classical education offered there. Latin and Greek bored him. He preferred collecting beetles, watching birds, and wandering through the countryside. His father despaired. Robert Darwin famously told his son, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." It was a harsh judgment, but understandable from a father's perspective. Charles seemed to have no direction, no ambition that aligned with respectable career paths. At 16, his father sent him to Edinburgh University to study medicine, following in the family tradition. It was a disaster from the start. Charles was squeamish. He witnessed surgeries performed without anesthesia, which wouldn't be introduced for another decade, and the screams of patients being cut open haunted him. He fled from the operating theater and never returned. The lectures were dull beyond measure, and he spent more time learning taxidermy from a freed slave named John Edmonstone, who taught him how to preserve bird specimens. Edmonstone also told him stories of the tropical rainforests of South America, painting pictures of a world utterly unlike the gray stone of Edinburgh. Those stories planted seeds. After 2 years, it was clear that Charles would never be a physician. His worried father decided on a new plan: the church. If Charles wouldn't be a doctor, perhaps he could be a country parson, a respectable position that would provide a comfortable living and plenty of time for his beetle collecting. So, in 1828, Charles was sent to Christ's College, Cambridge, to study for a Bachelor of Arts degree as preparation for ordination in the Church of England. At Cambridge, things were different. Charles still wasn't a particularly dedicated student of theology, but he found mentors who would change his life. He became close friends with botany professor John Stevens Henslow, with whom he took long walks discussing natural history. These walks became so regular that other students nicknamed Charles the man who walks with Henslow. He also came under the influence of geologist Adam Sedgwick, who taught him to read the landscape, to see in rocks and strata the deep history of the earth. It was also at Cambridge that Charles read 2 books that would prove transformative. The first was Alexander von Humboldt's personal narrative, an account of travels through South America that filled Charles with longing for adventure and scientific exploration. The second was William Paley's Natural Theology, which argued that the complexity and perfect adaptation of organisms proved the existence of a divine designer. Darwin was convinced by Paley's arguments at the time. The irony is beautiful. The book that most impressed young Darwin with the argument for design would later be exactly what his own theory would replace with a naturalistic explanation. Charles graduated in 1831, still with no clear path forward. The plan was still for him to become a country clergyman. He went on a geological expedition to Wales with Professor Sedgwick, learning fieldwork techniques and how to read the story told by rocks. When he returned home to Shrewsbury that August, a letter was waiting for him. It was from Professor Henslow, and it contained an opportunity that would change everything. Captain Robert Fitzroy was preparing to take command of HMS Beagle on a surveying voyage around the world, primarily to chart the coasts of South America. Fitzroy, a young captain from an aristocratic family, wanted a gentleman companion for the voyage, someone of similar social standing with whom he could dine and converse during the long months at sea. He also wanted this person to serve as the ship's naturalist, collecting and observing specimens. Henslow had recommended Darwin. Charles was electrified by the prospect, but his father was firmly opposed. Robert Darwin thought it was a wild scheme, a waste of time that would damage Charles's future prospects as a clergyman. The two argued, and Charles, who usually deferred to his father's wishes, reluctantly prepared to decline. But then his uncle, Josiah Wedgwood II, intervened. Josiah saw the value in the opportunity and convinced Robert to let Charles go. Permission was granted. There was one more hurdle. When Charles met Captain Fitzroy for his interview, the captain almost rejected him based on the shape of his nose. Fitzroy was a believer in physiognomy, the pseudoscientific idea that you could judge a person's character by their facial features. He thought Darwin's nose indicated a lack of energy and determination. Fortunately, Fitzroy decided to overlook his concerns, and Charles was accepted. On December 27, 1831, HMS Beagle set sail from Plymouth, England. Charles Darwin was 22 years old, recently graduated, with no real expertise or publications to his name. He was seasick almost constantly. The accommodations were cramped, with Charles sharing space with 22-year-old ship's surgeon Robert McCormick and working in a cabin so small he couldn't fully stand upright. He had no idea that this voyage would consume nearly 5 years of his life, or that the observations he would make would lead him to a theory that would revolutionize biology and challenge very foundations of how humans understood their place in the natural world. The young man who set sail that winter morning was still largely conventional in his thinking. He believed in the fixity of species. He admired Paley's design argument. He was preparing for a career in the church. But he was curious, observant, and willing to let evidence speak. Over the next 5 years, those qualities would slowly, inexorably, transform him. The voyage of the Beagle would be the making of Charles Darwin. The voyage that changed everything. The HMS Beagle was a small ship, a 10-gun brig sloop just 90 feet long. It carried a crew of 73, and for nearly 5 years, this cramped, floating world would be Charles Darwin's home. The original plan had been for a 2-year expedition, but delays, extended surveys, and the sheer scope of the mission stretched the voyage to 4 years and 9 months. From December 1831 to October 1836, Darwin would circle the globe, spending far more time on land than at sea. In fact, of those nearly 5 years, Darwin spent approximately 3 years and 3 months on shore, exploring, collecting, and observing. This would prove crucial because it was the land, not the sea, that would provide the observations that sparked his revolutionary insights. The voyage began miserably for Darwin. He was wretchedly seasick, suffering from nausea and misery whenever the ship was at sea. In his diary, he wrote, "The misery I endured from seasickness is far beyond what I ever guessed at." He wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. But when the Beagle made landfall, Darwin transformed. On shore, he was energetic, tireless, covering enormous distances on foot and horseback, collecting specimens, filling notebooks with observations about geology, plants, animals, and indigenous peoples. The Beagle's first major stop after leaving England was the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of Africa. Here, on the island of St. Jago, Darwin made his first significant geological observations. He found a band of white shells and corals embedded in rock high above the current sea level. This suggested that the land had been uplifted, that the Earth's surface was not static but dynamic, constantly changing over immense periods of time. This observation excited him tremendously. In his diary, he wrote, "It then first dawned on me that I might perhaps write a book on the geology of the various countries visited, and this made me thrill with delight." The Beagle then crossed the Atlantic to South America, where it would spend the bulk of the voyage. Darwin's first experience of a tropical rainforest came in Brazil in February 1832. He was overwhelmed by the riot of life, the complexity and interdependence of species, the sheer profusion of forms. "Here I first saw a tropical forest in all its sublime grandeur," he wrote. "I never experienced such intense delight." But he also witnessed the brutal reality of slavery, which appalled him. He saw enslaved people being tortured and families torn apart, and he argued with Fitzroy about it. Fitzroy, a Tory, defended the institution, while Darwin, influenced by his family's Whig politics and abolitionist sympathies, found it abhorrent. As the Beagle surveyed the coasts of Argentina and Uruguay, Darwin spent months exploring inland. He rode with gauchos across the pampas, witnessed their brutal campaigns to exterminate indigenous peoples, and collected fossil bones that would prove immensely significant. In the cliffs at Punta Alta, near Bahia Blanca, he discovered the fossilized remains of giant extinct mammals, creatures like Megatherium, a ground sloth as large as an elephant, and Glyptodon, an armadillo the size of a small car. These fossils fascinated and puzzled him. Why would God create magnificent creatures only to let them go extinct? And why did these extinct giants resemble the living sloths and armadillos of South America? It seemed to suggest some kind of connection, a pattern of descent. But Darwin wasn't yet ready to follow that thought to its conclusion. The geology captivated him as much as the biology. In September 1832, he found more evidence of land elevation, and he began to think seriously about the forces that could raise mountains and shape continents. He was reading Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, which argued for uniformitarianism. The idea that the same slow geological processes we see today, erosion, sedimentation, volcanic activity, have been shaping the Earth for vast stretches of time. This was in opposition to catastrophism, which held that the Earth's features were shaped by sudden, violent events like Noah's flood. Lyell's ideas gave Darwin a framework for thinking about deep time, the millions upon millions of years during which gradual changes could accumulate into dramatic transformations. In June 1834, the Beagle finally rounded Cape Horn and entered the Pacific. Darwin witnessed the eruption of Mount Osorno, a volcano in Chile, and in February 1835, while lying on a forest floor in Valdivia, Chile, he felt an earthquake, a massive tremor that lasted 2 minutes. He later visited the city of Concepcion, which had been leveled by the quake and subsequent tidal waves. Walking through the ruins, Darwin noted that the coastline had been raised several feet by the earthquake. Here was a proof that geological forces were still actively reshaping the Earth, lifting land from the sea, raising mountains incrementally with each convulsion. In March 1835, Darwin climbed high into the Andes Mountains, reaching elevations over 13,000 feet. There, far above the ocean, he found marine fossils, seashells embedded in rock near the peaks. The implications were staggering. These mountains had been raised from the seafloor, slowly, over unimaginable spans of time, through countless earthquakes and tectonic movements. The Earth, Darwin realized, was ancient beyond anything his culture generally accepted. And if the Earth was that old, and if such dramatic changes could occur gradually, what else might change slowly over time? What about living things themselves? Then came the moment that would forever be associated with Darwin's name, though, as we'll see, the reality was more complex than legend suggests. On September 15, 1835, the Beagle arrived at the Galapagos Islands, a volcanic archipelago 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador. The islands were young in geological terms, barren and harsh, covered with black lava, crawling with marine iguanas and giant tortoises, and inhabited by strange birds found nowhere else on Earth. Darwin spent 5 weeks in the Galapagos, visiting 4 of the islands: San Cristobal, Floriana, Isabela, and Santiago. He collected specimens of plants, birds, reptiles, and insects, though his collecting was not always as systematic as it might have been. The finches that would later bear his name did catch his attention, but he didn't immediately recognize their significance. He noted their varying beak shapes, but initially thought they might be wrens, finches, and blackbirds, representatives of different families. He didn't carefully label which island each bird came from, a mistake he would later regret. What did strike Darwin forcefully were the mockingbirds. On the first island, San Cristobal, he found mockingbirds that resembled those he'd seen on the South American mainland. But on Floriana, the mockingbirds were noticeably different, and on each subsequent island, the mockingbirds were distinct. This pattern was puzzling and exciting. Darwin carefully labeled his mockingbird specimens by island, sensing their importance. He also learned from locals that the giant tortoises differed from island to island in subtle ways, the shapes of their shells varying depending on their home island. If each island had its own unique forms of life, what did that mean? Darwin didn't have his eureka moment in the Galapagos. Despite popular legend, he didn't suddenly realize that species evolved while standing on those volcanic shores. His notes from the time show he was still thinking in terms of fixed species, though he was accumulating observations that didn't quite fit that framework. He wrote in his notebook, "When I see these islands in sight of each other and possessed of but a scanty stock of animals, tenanted by these birds, but slightly differing in structure and filling the same place in nature, I must suspect they are only varieties." But he left the question mark there uncertain, not yet ready to leap to evolution. After the Galapagos, the Beagle continued westward, visiting Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa. In Australia, Darwin was struck by the marsupials, the kangaroos and wombats and platypuses so different from mammals elsewhere. Why would God create entirely different sets of creatures for different continents? Why would South America have its own unique mammals, Australia its own, and so forth, if all were created independently? The pattern seemed to suggest that creatures were not distributed according to optimal design for their environments, but according to their geographical history, as if they had evolved from ancestors already present in those regions. By the time the Beagle reached the Cocos Islands in the Indian Ocean in April 1836, Darwin had already developed his theory about how coral reefs formed through the slow subsidence of volcanic islands over vast time periods. He was thinking like an evolutionary scientist, even if he hadn't yet applied that thinking to biology. When the Beagle finally returned to England in October 1836, Darwin was a changed man. The shy, uncertain young clergyman in training was gone. In his place was a naturalist with 5 years of unprecedented observations, notebooks full of questions, crates packed with specimens, and a mind trained to think in terms of gradual change over deep time. Darwin was also seasick, homesick, and exhausted. He wrote in relief, "I reached home late last night. My head is quite confused with so much delight." He would never travel far from England again, but the voyage had given him enough observations, enough questions, to fuel the rest of his life's work. The seeds of evolution were planted. Now, they needed time to grow. The seeds of a revolutionary idea. When Darwin returned to England in October 1836, he was no longer an obscure recent graduate. During the voyage, he had sent regular shipments of specimens back to England, along with letters describing his finds. These had been shared among prominent scientists by his mentor, Professor Henslow, and Darwin found himself arriving home with a growing reputation as a promising young naturalist. His fossil discoveries had attracted particular attention. Leading anatomist Richard Owen was eager to study the giant extinct mammals Darwin had unearthed. Darwin's reputation was secured enough that he felt confident he could make his way as a gentleman scientist, rather than becoming a country clergyman. But it was the birds that would prove most significant. Darwin took his bird specimens to John Gould, one of Britain's foremost ornithologists. And in March 1837, Gould delivered news that shocked Darwin. The finches from the Galapagos that Darwin had thought belonged to multiple different families were actually all closely related species, belonging to a unique group found nowhere else on Earth. Moreover, the mockingbirds from different islands were not just varieties, but distinct species. And here was the crucial fact. These species were clearly related to each other and to South American species, yet each was uniquely adapted to its particular island environment. This was the moment when the puzzle pieces began to hum and click into place for Darwin. If species were fixed and unchanging, specially created for their environments, why would God create slightly different versions on each island of the Galapagos? Why make them all similar to South American birds, rather than to birds elsewhere? The pattern only made sense if the birds had colonized the islands from South America, and then, over time, changed, diverged, adapted to their new homes. They had evolved. Darwin opened his first notebook on the transmutation of species in July 1837. The word transmutation was used because evolution didn't yet have its modern meaning. In this notebook, labeled simply B, Darwin began working through the implications of species changing over time. He drew a rough sketch of a branching tree, showing how species might diverge from common ancestors, splitting and splitting again over time. This tree of life, as he called it, was a radical vision. All life connected descended from earlier forms, constantly branching, with extinction pruning branches and adaptation shaping new ones. But the Darwin immediately recognized a crucial problem. If species could change, what was the mechanism? What force drove and directed that change? He observed that variation existed in populations. No two individuals were exactly alike. Breeders of pigeons, dogs, and cattle knew this well and had used it to create dramatically different varieties through selective breeding, choosing which individuals would reproduce based on desired traits. This was artificial selection. But what could produce similar results in nature where there was no conscious breeder making choices? Darwin struggled with this question for over a year. He read voraciously, looking for clues in every direction. And then, in September 1838, he read an essay by political economist Thomas Malthus titled An Essay on the Principle of Population. Malthus argued that human populations naturally increase faster than food supplies, leading to competition for resources and inevitable struggle. Most people would be born into poverty, and many would die young because there simply wasn't enough food, space, and resources for all. This was the key Darwin had been seeking. He realized that Malthus's principle applied not just to humans, but to all organisms. Every species produces more offspring than can possibly survive to reproduce themselves. A single pair of elephants, breeding slowly over centuries, could produce millions of descendants if all survived. A codfish lays millions of eggs. An oak tree produces thousands of acorns. And yet, populations remain relatively stable. Most individuals die before reproducing. There is a constant struggle for existence, a competition for limited resources. Darwin saw how this struggle could drive change. In any population, individuals vary. Some are faster, some stronger, some better camouflaged, some more resistant to disease. If these variations affected an individuals' chances of surviving and reproducing, then, over time, favorable variations would become more common because individuals possessing them would leave more offspring. Unfavorable variations would become rarer because individuals possessing them would leave fewer offspring or none at all. Over many generations, this process would gradually shape populations, adapting them ever more closely to their environments. Species would change. This was natural selection. Darwin had his theory. It was elegant, powerful, and based on observable facts. But he also immediately understood how controversial it would be. Evolution challenged the fixity of species, a cornerstone of natural theology. It implied that humans were not specially created but descended from earlier animals. It suggested that the apparent design in nature was not the work of a divine designer, but the product of a mindless natural process. This theory could get him branded as a heretic or a madman. So Darwin did something remarkable. He decided to keep quiet about it. For nearly 20 years, he told only his closest friends, Charles Lyell and botanist Joseph Hooker, about his theory. He shared his ideas in private letters, testing their reactions, gathering feedback. But he didn't publish. Instead, He spent those 2 decades meticulously gathering evidence, building his case, anticipating objections, working out the implications of his theory in immense detail. During these years, Darwin's life changed dramatically. In 1839, he married his cousin Emma Wedgwood. Emma was kind, intelligent, and deeply religious, and she worried about Charles's increasingly heterodox views. They had 10 children together, though 3 died young, including their beloved daughter Annie at age 10, a loss that devastated Darwin and shook what remained of his religious faith. The family moved from London to Down House, a quiet country home in Kent, where Darwin would spend the rest of his life. At Down House, Darwin established a routine. He suffered from chronic illness, experiencing bouts of stomach pain, vomiting, headaches, and fatigue that would plague him for decades. The cause has never been definitively identified. Theories range from Chagas disease, contracted from an insect bite in South America, to psychosomatic stress, to lactose intolerance. Whatever the cause, it meant he could only work a few hours a day. But he used those hours with incredible discipline. He conducted detailed studies of barnacles, spending 8 years dissecting and classifying them, becoming the world's leading expert. This work gave him a deep understanding of variation within species, and how difficult it sometimes was to draw clear lines between species and varieties. He bred pigeons, studying how easily dramatic differences could be produced through selective breeding. He corresponded with breeders of dogs, cattle, plants, anyone who worked with domesticated species, gathering data on variation and inheritance. He experimented with seed dispersal, testing how long seeds could survive in salt water to see if they might float between continents. He studied the geographic distribution of plants and animals, looking for patterns. All of this work was in service of his theory. Darwin was building a fortress of evidence, fact upon fact, observation upon observation, until the case for evolution by natural selection would be overwhelming. He planned to publish a massive multi-volume work laying it all out in exhaustive detail. He might have continued this way indefinitely, perfecting his arguments, if events hadn't forced his hand. In June 1858, Darwin received a letter from a young naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace, who was then collecting specimens in the Malay archipelago. Wallace had independently arrived at the theory of natural selection. He sent Darwin a short essay outlining the theory and asked Darwin to pass it along to Charles Lyell. Darwin was stunned. Wallace's essay expressed in condensed form the idea Darwin had been nursing for 20 years. Darwin faced a crisis of conscience and priority. If Wallace published first, Darwin would lose credit for the discovery. But if Darwin published immediately, it would seem he was stealing Wallace's idea. Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker, Darwin's closest scientific confidants, found a solution. On July 1, 1858, they arranged for papers by both Darwin and Wallace to be presented jointly before the Linnean Society of London. Darwin's contributions were extracts from an essay he'd written years earlier and from a letter to American botanist Asa Gray. Wallace's essay was read in full. Neither man was present. Darwin was home grieving the recent death of his infant son, and Wallace was still in the Far East. The joint presentation caused a little stir at the time, but it established priority and spurred Darwin to finally publish. He abandoned his plans for a vast multi-volume treatise and instead wrote what he called the abstract of his theory. Even this abstract ran to over 150,000 words. The book was titled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. It was published on November 24, 1859, and it changed the world. The core principles of natural selection. At the heart of Darwin's theory lies an idea of almost crystalline simplicity, so simple that when biologist Thomas Henry Huxley first read it, he supposedly said, "How extremely stupid not to have thought of that." And yet this simple idea explained the astonishing diversity, complexity, and adaptation of life on Earth without requiring supernatural intervention. Let's walk through the core principles of natural selection, the logical steps that lead inevitably to evolutionary change. The first principle is overproduction. Every living thing is capable of producing more offspring than could possibly survive to reproduce themselves. Darwin started Origin of Species with this observation, drawing on examples from across the natural world. A single codfish can lay 1,000,000 eggs in a season. A dandelion produces thousands of seeds. Even slow-breeding elephants, if they began with a single pair and all offspring survived and reproduced, would produce over 15 million descendants in 500 years. The potential for population growth is exponential, geometric. Each generation could double, then double again, then again. And yet, when we look at actual populations, they don't explode like this. The number of codfish in the ocean remains roughly stable from year to year. Forests aren't overtaken by an exponentially increasing number of dandelions. Elephant populations grow slowly, if at all. Something prevents the potential population growth from being realized. Most individuals die before they can reproduce. Of 1,000,000 cod eggs, perhaps only 2 fish survive to adulthood and produce offspring of their own, just enough to replace their parents. Of thousands of dandelion seeds, most never germinate. Or they sprout only to be eaten. Or they grow but fail to produce seeds of their own. This leads to the second principle, the struggle for existence. Darwin borrowed this phrase and the concept behind it from Thomas Malthus, but he expanded it far beyond Malthus's original meaning. The struggle for existence is not just about combat, not just about predators hunting prey, though that's certainly part of it. It's about competition for everything necessary for life. Plants struggle for sunlight, spreading their leaves to capture light before their neighbors can. Animals struggle for food, for water, for places to sleep and nest and mate. They struggle against the elements, against drought and flood, heat and cold. They struggle against disease and parasites. This struggle is often indirect and subtle. A plant doesn't defeat its neighbors in direct combat. It simply grows a bit faster or reaches a bit higher. An animal doesn't need to fight every rival. It simply needs to secure enough resources to survive and reproduce. But the struggle is real and relentless because resources are limited. There is not enough food for everyone. There are not enough safe nesting sites for every bird. There is not enough of everything to allow all offspring to survive. Competition is inevitable. Now we come to the third principle, and this is crucial. Variation. No two individuals of any species are exactly alike. Visit a meadow and look at the dandelions. Some are taller, some shorter. Some have broader leaves, some narrower. Some are more resistant to frost, some less. Some produce more seeds, some fewer. This variation exists in every population of every species. Darwin observed it in pigeons, in barnacles, in every organism he studied. Breeders and farmers knew it well. It was the raw material they used to create new breeds through selective breeding. Darwin didn't know the source of variation. The mechanisms of heredity were a mystery in his time. But he knew variation existed, and that at least some of it was heritable, passed from parents to offspring. This was the fourth principle: inheritance. Children resemble their parents more than they resemble random individuals from the population. Tall parents tend to have taller children. Fast rabbits tend to have faster offspring. The variations are passed down through generations. Here's where the magic happens, where these simple principles combine to produce evolution. If individuals vary, if some variations affect their chances of survival and reproduction, if those variations are heritable, then over time the population will change. Individuals with favorable variations, traits that help them survive and reproduce in their particular environment, will leave more offspring. Because those offspring inherit the favorable traits, those traits will become more common in the next generation. Meanwhile, individuals with unfavorable variations will leave fewer offspring or none at all, and those traits will become rarer. This is natural selection, Darwin's great insight. Nature, through the struggle for existence, selects which individuals will reproduce and which will not. It is not conscious selection, of course. There's no intelligence guiding it. But the effect is the same as if a breeder were choosing which individuals to breed. Favorable traits accumulate. The population gradually becomes better adapted to its environment. Let's illustrate with a simple example Darwin might have used. Imagine a population of birds on an island where the primary food source is seeds. The birds have varying beak sizes. Some have larger, stronger beaks, some smaller, more delicate beaks. Now suppose a drought occurs, and the delicate seeds the small-beaked birds could easily crack become scarce. Only large, hard seeds remain abundant. The birds with larger, stronger beaks can crack these hard seeds efficiently and get enough food. The birds with smaller beaks struggle. Many starve. Fewer of them survive to reproduce. The next generation will have a higher proportion of large-beaked birds because the large-beaked parents produced more offspring. If the drought continues for many generations, the population will shift. Large beaks will become the norm. Small beaks rare or absent. The population has evolved. This isn't speculation. This exact pattern has been observed in Darwin's finches in the Galapagos. During severe droughts in the 1970s and 80s, evolutionary biologists Peter and Rosemary Grant documented natural selection in action. watching as the average beak size of ground finches increased during drought years when only large, tough seeds were available, then decreased again when the rains returned and small seeds became abundant. Evolution happening in real time, observable within a human lifetime. Crucially, natural selection has no foresight, no goal. It doesn't create traits because they'll be needed in the future. It simply filters existing variation, favoring whatever helps survival and reproduction in the current environment. If the environment changes, different traits may be favored. A trait beneficial in one place or time may be harmful in another. This is why evolution is not progressive, not a march toward perfection. It's adaptation to local circumstances, and those circumstances are always shifting. Darwin also recognized that natural selection could work in different ways. Sometimes it's about survival, living long enough to reproduce. Sometimes it's about fecundity, producing more offspring. And sometimes, as Darwin would explore in later work, it's about mating success, being chosen by potential mates. He called this sexual selection, and we'll return to it later. The philosopher Herbert Spencer coined the phrase survival of the fittest to describe natural selection, and Darwin adopted it in later editions of Origin of Species. But this phrase is often misunderstood. Fitness in evolutionary terms doesn't mean physical fitness or strength. It means reproductive fitness, leaving offspring who themselves survive to reproduce. An organism is fit if it successfully passes its genes to future generations. A frail but fertile individual who produces many surviving offspring is more fit than a robust individual who produces none. All of these principles work together in a process that's gradual, incremental, patient. One generation might see tiny changes, barely noticeable, but over hundreds, thousands, millions of generations, those tiny changes accumulate. Populations diverge. New species arise. The tree of life branches and branches again. From simple beginnings, Darwin argued, all the complexity and diversity of life could emerge through this simple, natural process. No miracles required. No divine intervention necessary. Just variation, inheritance, selection, and deep time. This was Darwin's revolution. Not just that species evolved, though that was radical enough, but that he'd provided a mechanism, a process that could explain how evolution occurred. Natural selection transformed evolution from speculation into science, from vague ideas about transmutation into a testable theory that made predictions and explained patterns. It was, as modern biologists often say, the single best idea anyone has ever had. On the Origin of Species, the book that shook the world. On November 24, 1859, John Murray published 1,250 copies of On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Every copy sold out on the first day. Darwin's publisher immediately ordered a second printing. By Darwin's death in 1882, the book had gone through 6 editions, been translated into nearly every major European language, and fundamentally reshaped how educated people understood the living world. The book was not an easy read. At over 155,000 words, it was dense with detail, argumentation, and evidence. Darwin wrote in a style that was careful, sometimes repetitive, always methodical. He anticipated objections and addressed them preemptively. He acknowledged difficulties and uncertainties. He was, in short, the opposite of a polemicist. He made his revolutionary argument in the most cautious, thorough, gentlemanly manner imaginable. The structure of Origin is revealing of Darwin's strategy. He didn't begin with wild claims about human evolution or the absence of God. Instead, he started with the familiar, domesticated animals and plants. His first chapter detailed how breeders had created dramatically different varieties of pigeons, dogs, cattle, and crops through selective breeding. Darwin himself had bred pigeons, becoming deeply familiar with the fancy varieties produced by pigeon fanciers. He showed that all domestic pigeon breeds, from powders to tumblers to fantails, had descended from the rock pigeon. They had been created not by God, but by human selection. Yet the differences between them were as great as the differences naturalists use to distinguish separate species. This was brilliant rhetoric. If such dramatic changes could be produced by artificial selection in just a few centuries or even decades, why couldn't natural selection, operating over millions of years, produce even greater changes? If breeders could create new varieties, why couldn't nature create new species? Darwin was making the unfamiliar comprehensible by analogy with the familiar. Only after establishing this groundwork did Darwin introduce natural selection. He explained the struggle for existence, variation, inheritance, and the process by which favorable variations would be preserved and unfavorable ones eliminated. He discussed how geographic isolation could allow populations to diverge into separate species. He addressed the question of how complex organs like the eye could evolve through gradual steps, each providing some advantage. He devoted entire chapters to potential difficulties and objections. Why, if species descended with modification, was the fossil record full of gaps rather than showing smooth gradations? Darwin's answer was that the geological record was incomparably incomplete, like a history book with most pages missing. Why did some species show apparently useless ornaments or structures? Darwin acknowledged this was a problem for natural selection alone, which is why he would later develop his theory of sexual selection. How could instincts evolve? Darwin showed how even complex behaviors like the honeybee's hexagonal honeycomb construction could arise through gradual modification. He addressed geographic distribution. Why were there marsupials in Australia but not Europe? Why did oceanic islands have their own unique species but always species related to the nearest mainland? The patterns made sense if species had evolved and spread from centers of origin, modified by descent, unable to cross impassable barriers like oceans. They made no sense if each species had been independently created for its environment. He discussed embryology, noting that embryos of different vertebrates looked remarkably similar in early stages, more similar than the adults. Why would this be unless they shared common ancestry? He discussed vestigial organs, structures that seemed to serve no purpose, like the tiny hind limb bones hidden inside whales. Why would a divine designer give whales useless leg bones unless whales had descended from four-legged ancestors? What Darwin very carefully did not do was discuss human evolution in Origin. The entire book contained exactly one sentence about humans. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. That's it. Darwin knew that applying evolution to humans would be the most controversial aspect of his theory, so he avoided it, allowing readers to draw their own conclusions. Many did immediately. If Darwin was right, humans were not specially created but had evolved like every other species, descended from earlier primates, from earlier mammals, ultimately from simple organisms. We were part of nature, products of the same mindless processes that shaped beetles and barnacles. The immediate reaction to origin was mixed but generally more positive than Darwin had feared. Many scientists, especially younger ones, were quickly convinced. Thomas Henry Huxley became evolution's most aggressive public defender, earning the nickname Darwin's Bulldog for his fierce advocacy. Botanist Joseph Hooker and geologist Charles Lyell, despite initial reservations, came around to supporting the theory. Wallace, who had independently discovered natural selection, was enthusiastically supportive. But there was also significant opposition, and it came from multiple directions. Some scientists rejected evolution on purely scientific grounds. The physicist William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, calculated that the Earth was only 100 million years old, far too young for Darwinian evolution to have produced all life's diversity. This was a serious problem that wouldn't be resolved until the discovery of radioactivity showed that Earth was actually billions of years old, giving evolution plenty of time. The biologist St. George Mivart argued that incipient stages of complex organs would provide no advantage, so natural selection couldn't explain how organs like wings or ears could evolve. These scientific criticisms spurred Darwin to revise and strengthen his arguments in later editions. Religious opposition was intense, though not universal. Many clergy and theologians rejected evolution as incompatible with the Genesis creation account and with humanity's special status as created in God's image. The famous 1860 debate at Oxford saw Bishop Samuel Wilberforce attack evolution on theological grounds only to be demolished in argument by Thomas Huxley. But other religious figures found ways to reconcile evolution with faith, arguing that God could work through natural laws, that evolution could be God's method of creation. Darwin himself remained publicly circumspect about religious implications, though privately his faith had eroded into agnosticism. There was also a darker side to the theory's reception. Some people seized on evolution to justify social and political views Darwin never intended. Social Darwinism emerged, applying concepts like survival of the fittest to human societies to argue that inequalities were natural and inevitable, that helping the poor interfered with natural selection, that certain races were more evolved than others. These were distortions of Darwin's actual arguments, but they caused real harm and associated evolution with positions Darwin would have rejected. Despite controversies, evolution gained acceptance remarkably quickly in scientific circles. Within a decade of Origin's publication, most biologists accepted that evolution had occurred, that species were not fixed but changeable, that all life shared common ancestry. Natural selection was more controversial. Many scientists accepted evolution but proposed alternative mechanisms. But evolution itself, the fact that species changed over time through descent with modification, became the organizing principle of biology. Darwin continued to refine his arguments, publishing 6 editions of Origin. The first edition is generally considered the best. Later editions made concessions to critics that weakened the argument, particularly regarding inheritance, where Darwin unfortunately adopted some Lamarckian ideas about acquired characteristics being inherited. But the core of the theory remained powerful and revolutionary. Looking back, Origin of Species is one of the most important books ever written. It provided a unifying theory for biology, explaining patterns that had seemed arbitrary or inexplicable. It changed how humans understood themselves and their place in nature. It demonstrated that complexity and adaptation didn't require a designer, but could emerge from simple, natural processes. It showed that science could provide naturalistic explanations for phenomena that had seemed to require supernatural causes. In many ways, it completed the scientific revolution begun centuries earlier, extending scientific explanation to the living world as fully as physics explained the non-living, and at the center of it all was a quiet, chronically ill man in a country house in Kent, methodically gathering evidence, writing careful arguments, fundamentally transforming human knowledge while dealing with stomach aches and exhaustion. Charles Darwin had done what he set out to do. He'd made the case for evolution by natural selection, and he'd made it so thoroughly that the world could never be quite the same again. Evidence and examples. How evolution works. Darwin's theory wasn't just elegant logic. It was rooted in overwhelming evidence from multiple fields of study. Let's explore some of the most compelling evidence for evolution, both from Darwin's time and from the century and a half since, evidence that has only strengthened the case for descent with modification through natural selection. Start with comparative anatomy, one of Darwin's strongest arguments. When you examine the 4 limbs of different vertebrates, you find something remarkable. The same basic bone structure, modified for different purposes. A human arm, a cat's front leg, a whale's flipper, a bat's wing, a bird's wing, they all contain the same fundamental arrangement of bones. Upper arm bone, forearm bones, wrist bones, hand bones, fingers. The proportions differ. Some bones are elongated or shortened, some fused or separated, but the underlying pattern is the same. Why would this be if each animal were independently designed for its way of life? Surely a designer could create a whale's flipper from scratch without including bones that resemble finger bones. But if these animals descended from a common ancestor with that basic limb structure, then it makes perfect sense. Evolution works with existing structures, modifying them through natural selection for new purposes. It's tinkering, not designing from blank paper. This pattern of similarity due to common ancestry is called homology, and it's found throughout the living world. Even more telling are vestigial structures, organs that serve little or no function but resemble structures that are functional in related species. Darwin pointed to many examples: the tiny pelvis and hind limb bones in whales and snakes, animals that have no external hind legs. Why would they have these hidden bones unless they descended from 4-legged ancestors? The human appendix, once thought completely useless, is another example, though we now know it does have some minor immune function. Flightless birds have reduced wings. Cave-dwelling animals often have tiny, non-functional eyes. These vestigial structures make sense only in light of evolution. Their evolutionary baggage, remnants of ancestral traits no longer needed but not yet completely eliminated because they do no harm. A designer would have no reason to include them, but evolution carries its history in every organism's body. The fossil record provides another powerful line of evidence. When Darwin wrote Origin, the fossil record was admittedly patchy, and he acknowledged this as a difficulty. But even then, there were suggestive patterns. Fossils appeared in a sequence consistent with evolution. Simple organisms in the oldest rocks, complex ones in more recent rocks. No rabbits in the Precambrian, as biologist J.B.S. Haldane would later quip. The pattern was never violated. Since Darwin's time, the fossil record has filled in spectacularly. Paleontologists have found transitional fossils, organisms that show intermediate characteristics between major groups. Tiktaalik, discovered in 2004, is a beautiful example. A creature with features of both fish and tetrapods, with fins that contained bones capable of supporting weight, dating to exactly the period when the transition from water to land occurred. Archaeopteryx, discovered just 2 years after Origin was published, showed a mix of reptilian and bird features, with teeth and a long bony tail like a reptile but with feathers like a bird. We have whale fossils showing the transition from land mammals to fully aquatic creatures, with intermediates that walked on land but hunted in water, still with hind legs but adapted for swimming. We have numerous fossils documenting the evolution of horses from small, multi-toed forest browsers to large, single-toed grazers. The fossil record is still incomplete. It always will be because fossilization is rare. But the fossils we have consistently support evolution and never contradict it. Geographic distribution of species provided Darwin with compelling evidence. Islands were particularly revealing. Oceanic islands, ones that had never been connected to continents, had unique species found nowhere else, but those species were always most similar to species on the nearest mainland. The Galapagos finches resembled South American finches. Madagascar's animals resembled African animals. This pattern makes sense if islands were colonized by mainland species that then evolved in isolation. It makes no sense if species were created independently for each location. Similarly, regions with similar climates but on different continents had completely different species filling similar ecological roles. The deserts of Australia had kangaroos. African deserts had antelopes. Convergent evolution, where unrelated organisms evolve similar features in response to similar environmental pressures, showed that natural selection was at work. Australian marsupials evolved species that paralleled placental mammals elsewhere. Marsupial moles, marsupial mice, marsupial wolves, all convergently resembling their placental counterparts despite very different ancestries. Embryology provided another rich source of evidence. The great embryologist Carl Ernst von Baer had noticed that embryos of different vertebrates looked remarkably similar in early stages. A human embryo at certain stages looks nearly identical to a fish embryo or a chicken embryo, with gill slits and a tail. As development proceeds, the embryos diverge, each following its own path to its adult form. This pattern makes sense if vertebrates shared a common ancestor. They all start with the ancestral developmental program and then modify it. Darwin didn't know about DNA, about genes, about the molecular basis of heredity. But molecular biology has provided perhaps the strongest evidence for evolution. All life on Earth uses the same genetic code, the same basic biochemistry. This unity of life points to common ancestry. When we compare DNA, sequences from different species, we find patterns of similarity that match evolutionary predictions. Humans and chimps share over 98% of their DNA. We share less with more distant relatives like dogs, even less with fish, but we still share recognizable genes with them, even with bacteria and plants. The more recently two species diverged from a common ancestor, the more similar their DNA. This is exactly what evolution predicts. We can even observe evolution happening in real time, on timescales fast enough for humans to witness. The peppered moth in England is a famous example. Before the Industrial Revolution, most peppered moths were light-colored, camouflaged against lichen-covered trees. Dark-colored moths were rare because birds easily spotted and ate them. But industrial pollution killed the lichens and darkened the trees with soot. Suddenly, light-colored moths stood out, and dark-colored moths were camouflaged. Within decades, the population shifted. Dark moths became common, light moths rare. When pollution controls cleaned up the environment in the late 20th century, the pattern reversed. Light moths became common again. This was natural selection observed directly. Antibiotic resistance in bacteria is evolution happening before our eyes, though we wish it weren't. When a bacterial population is exposed to an antibiotic, most bacteria die, but a few have random mutations that make them resistant. These resistant bacteria survive, reproduce, and soon the entire population is resistant. The antibiotic has selected for resistance. This is why doctors warn against overusing antibiotics. We're driving the evolution of super-resistant bacteria through artificial selection. The Grant's decades-long study of Darwin's finches in the Galapagos, mentioned earlier, documented natural selection happening year by year, generation by generation. They measured thousands of finches, tracking beak sizes, body sizes, and survival rates. During drought years, when only large, tough seeds were available, birds with larger beaks survived better, and the average beak size in the population increased. During wet years, when small seeds were abundant, smaller beaks were favored and the average decreased. They watched evolution happen in real time, driven by natural selection responding to environmental changes. Another type of evidence comes from imperfect design. If organisms were designed by an intelligent, omnipotent designer, we might expect them to be optimal. But evolution doesn't produce optimal design. It produces good enough design, tinkering with what already exists rather than starting from scratch. This explains why organisms are full of quirks and inefficiencies. The human eye, often cited as an example of perfect design, actually has some rather poor features. The light-sensitive cells in the retina are oriented backward, with the nerves and blood vessels in front of them rather than behind, obstructing light and creating a blind spot where the optic nerve exits. Intelligent designer wouldn't do this, but evolution, modifying the eye structure inherited from earlier ancestors, ended up with this configuration. Cephalopod eyes, like those of octopuses which evolved independently, have the sensory cells oriented the right way around. Evolution found different solutions in different lineages. Or consider the human pharynx, where the pathways for food and air cross, making choking a constant hazard. Or the recurrent laryngeal nerve in giraffes, which runs from the brain down the neck to the chest, loops around a major blood vessel, and runs all the way back up the neck to the larynx, a detour of several meters when a direct path would be a few inches. This absurd route makes sense only as an evolutionary heritage from fish, in which the nerve followed a direct path, but which in tetrapods and their descendants got stretched longer and longer as necks evolved, natural selection never finding a way to reroute it. These examples of imperfection, of historical contingency, of jury-rigged solutions are actually strong evidence for evolution. They show that organisms bear the marks of their history, that they're modified descendants of earlier forms, not products of fresh design. All of these lines of evidence, comparative anatomy, fossils, geographic distribution, embryology, molecular biology, observed evolution, imperfect design, all point to the same conclusion. Species evolve. They change over time through descent with modification, and natural selection is a major mechanism driving that change. The evidence is overwhelming, coming from every field of biology, all of it consistent, none of it contradicting evolution. This is why evolution is not a guess or a belief, but a scientific fact, as well established as the fact that the Earth orbits the Sun. Darwin couldn't have known how strong the case would become. He made his argument with the evidence available in the mid-19th century, and it was already compelling. But every subsequent discovery, from genetics to plate tectonics to molecular biology, has only strengthened the case. If Darwin were alive today, he would be astonished and delighted by how thoroughly his theory has been confirmed. Beyond Origin, Darwin's later work and the Descent of Man. Publishing. On the Origin of Species didn't end Darwin's scientific work, it began a new phase. For the next 23 years, until his death in 1882, Darwin continued to research, experiment, and write, producing a series of books that expanded on the ideas introduced in Origin and explored their implications. These later works are less famous than Origin, but they contain some of Darwin's most insightful ideas and extend his evolutionary framework to topics he'd deliberately avoided in his first book. One of these topics was human evolution. In Origin, Darwin had included just one sentence suggesting that light would be thrown on human origins. He knew that applying evolution to humans would be the most controversial aspect of his theory, so he held back. But others didn't. Thomas Henry Huxley published Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature in 1863, arguing forcefully that humans were primates, closely related to apes. The public was alternately fascinated and scandalized. Cartoons showed Darwin with an ape's body, mocking the idea that we descended from monkeys. Finally, in 1871, Darwin published The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. This 2-volume work made explicit what had been implicit in Origin. Humans evolved like every other species through natural selection operating on variation over deep time. We were not separately created but descended from earlier primates, ultimately sharing common ancestry with all life. Darwin laid out the evidence systematically. Anatomically, humans were clearly mammals, primates specifically. We shared with apes the same basic body structure, the same arrangements of organs, bones, and muscles. We had vestigial structures like wisdom teeth, the appendix, muscles for wiggling our ears, body hair that served little purpose. Our embryos went through stages resembling those of other mammals. Our DNA, though Darwin didn't know about DNA, would later show that we shared over 98% of our genetic material with chimpanzees and bonobos. But Darwin went further. He argued that not just our bodies but our minds had evolved. Our intelligence, our emotions, our moral sense. These were not supernatural gifts but products of natural selection operating on our ancestors' brains and behaviors. He showed that animals displayed rudimentary forms of traits we considered uniquely human: tool use, cooperation, care for injured companions, even apparently purposeless play. The differences between human and animal minds were of degree, not kind. This was deeply troubling to Victorian society. It suggested that human reason, the faculty that supposedly elevated us above mere beasts, was itself a product of animalistic evolution. Our moral sense, which many believed came from God, could be explained as an adaptation for social living. Nothing was sacred, nothing special about humans that required invoking the divine. We were part of nature, products of the same processes that shaped beetles and barnacles and baboons. In Descent, Darwin also developed his theory of sexual selection, which he'd introduced briefly in Origin. Natural selection explained adaptation for survival, but it struggled to explain features that seemed useless or even harmful for survival. Peacock tails, for instance, were enormous, gaudy, and made peacocks vulnerable to predators. Why would natural selection produce such apparently disadvantageous traits? Darwin's answer was that natural selection wasn't the only force shaping organisms. Sexual selection, selection based on mating success rather than survival, could favor traits that helped an individual attract mates or defeat rivals, even if those traits harmed survival. Peacock tails were attractive to peahens, and a peacock with a magnificent tail would father more offspring despite living a slightly shorter, more dangerous life. Over generations, sexual selection would drive the evolution of elaborate ornaments and behaviors. Sexual selection worked in 2 ways. Intersexual selection involved choosing mates, usually females choosing males based on attractive traits. Intrasexual selection involved competition between members of the same sex, usually males, competing with other males for access to females. This explained not just ornaments like peacock tails, but also weapons like deer antlers and behaviors like territorial fights. Darwin applied sexual selection to humans too. He argued that many human traits, from beards to musical ability to language itself, might have been shaped partly by sexual selection, by our ancestors choosing mates based on these characteristics. This was speculative, and Darwin knew it, but it opened up rich veins of research that continue to this day. Darwin's other late works explored diverse topics. The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, 1872, argued that our facial expressions and emotional displays had evolutionary origins, showing continuity with other animals. It was one of the first scientific treatments of psychology. The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms, 1881. His last book seems at first glance trivial, a book about earthworms. But the Darwin showed that these humble creatures, through their tunneling and digestion of organic matter, gradually transformed the landscape, burying ancient ruins and aerating soil. Small forces, acting over long periods, produced vast effects. It was the same principle as geological uniformitarianism and evolution itself. He also published books on orchids, on carnivorous plants, on the movement of climbing plants, on cross-fertilization and self-fertilization in plants. All of these works explored how natural selection shaped specific adaptations, filling in details and extending the evolutionary framework to new realms. Darwin remained deeply curious and experimentally minded even as his health declined. His garden at Down House became a laboratory where he conducted intricate experiments, testing how seeds dispersed, how plants responded to stimuli, how pollinators and plants co-evolved. Through all this work, Darwin remained cautious in his claims, exhaustive in his evidence, and open to criticism. He continued to revise Origin through 6 editions, responding to objections and incorporating new findings. He corresponded with scientists around the world, gathering data, testing ideas, engaging with alternative theories. He was, in short, a model of how science should be done: rigorous, humble, and endlessly curious. By the time of his death in 1882 at age 73, Darwin had lived to see his theory largely accepted by the scientific community. He died at Down House, surrounded by family, and was buried with great honor in Westminster Abbey, near Isaac Newton. A man who had challenged some of the deepest beliefs of his society was laid to rest in the nation's most sacred space, recognized as one of history's greatest minds. The country parson he might have been was long forgotten. In his place was the naturalist who had revealed humanity's place in the natural world. The modern synthesis. Darwin meets genetics. Despite the rapid acceptance of evolution in the decades after Origin, natural selection remained controversial throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Many biologists accepted that evolution had occurred, but rejected or downplayed natural selection as the primary mechanism. This period, sometimes called the eclipse of Darwinism, saw alternative mechanisms proposed and debated. It wasn't until the 1930s and 40s that Darwin's theory was fully vindicated through what became known as the modern synthesis, the integration of Darwinian evolution with Mendelian genetics. The problem was heredity. Darwin knew that traits were inherited, but he didn't know how. He proposed a theory called pangenesis, suggesting that every part of the body produced tiny particles called gemmules that traveled to the reproductive organs and were passed to offspring. This was wrong, and Darwin's contemporaries largely rejected it. More problematically, the prevailing view of heredity in Darwin's time was that it was blending. Traits from both parents were thought to blend in offspring like mixing paint. So a tall person and a short person would have medium-height children. But blending inheritance created a serious problem for natural selection. If traits blended, then beneficial variations would be diluted with each generation, blended back toward the average. A favorable mutation would blend with normal traits, its advantage halved in the first generation, quartered in the second, soon becoming undetectable. Natural selection couldn't work effectively if inheritance was blending. Unknown to Darwin, the solution to this problem was being discovered during his lifetime by an Augustinian monk named Gregor Mendel. Working in a monastery garden in what is now the Czech Republic, Mendel conducted meticulous breeding experiments with pea plants. He tracked traits like seed color, pod shape, and plant height through multiple generations, carefully recording the ratios of offspring with different traits. What Mendel discovered was that inheritance wasn't blending but particulate. Traits were controlled by discrete units, what we now call genes, that were passed intact from parent to offspring. These units came in different versions, alleles, and offspring received one allele from each parent. Crucially, if you had one allele for yellow seeds and one for green seeds, the yellow allele might dominate and the plant would produce yellow seeds, but the green allele was still there hidden and could appear in future generations. Traits didn't blend. They were shuffled and recombined, but the underlying particles remained distinct. Mendel published his results in 1866, but they were ignored. The paper appeared in an obscure journal, and its significance wasn't recognized. Darwin never heard of Mendel's work. Mendel died in 1884, unknown as a scientist. But in 1900, 3 different botanists independently rediscovered Mendel's principles, and suddenly, Mendelian genetics exploded into scientific consciousness. At first, Mendelians and Darwinians were at odds. Some geneticists thought Mendelian inheritance, with its discrete particles and distinct variations, was incompatible with Darwinian gradualism. They proposed alternative theories of evolution based on sudden mutations, big jumps that created new species in one or a few generations. But gradually, mathematically minded biologists showed that Mendelian genetics and Darwinian natural selection were not just compatible, but complementary. The key figures in this synthesis were 3 mathematicians: Ronald Fisher, J.B.S. Haldane, and Sewell Wright. Working in the 1920s and 30s, they developed population genetics, a mathematical framework for understanding how gene frequencies change in populations over time. They showed that natural selection, working on small Mendelian variations, could produce gradual evolutionary change exactly as Darwin had envisioned. Fisher's 1930 book, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, was foundational. He showed mathematically how even small selective advantages, just 1% difference in survival or reproduction, could drive significant evolutionary change over thousands of generations. He demonstrated that Mendelian inheritance actually made natural selection work better, not worse, because favorable alleles didn't blend away but remained distinct and could increase in frequency. Meanwhile, paleontologist and geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky brought together genetics, field biology, and evolutionary theory. His 1937 book, Genetics and the Origin of Species, integrated the mathematical work of Fisher, Haldane, and Wright with real-world observations of variation in wild populations. Dobzhansky showed that natural populations contained vast amounts of genetic variation, providing ample raw material for natural selection to act on. Other scientists contributed to the synthesis from different fields. Ornithologist Ernst Mayr brought insights from systematics and biogeography, clarifying how new species formed through geographic isolation and divergence. Paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson showed that the fossil record was consistent with gradual Darwinian evolution when properly understood. Botanist G. Ledyard Stebbins applied the synthesis to plant evolution. By the 1950s, the modern synthesis was complete. Evolution was understood as a change in gene frequencies in populations over time, driven primarily by natural selection, but also by other factors like genetic drift, mutation, and gene flow. Speciation occurred when populations became reproductively isolated and diverged through accumulated genetic differences. The synthesis unified biology, providing a framework that connected genetics, paleontology, ecology, systematics, and every other biological field. The synthesis also resolved mysteries that had plagued Darwin. The age of the Earth, once a problem, was revealed by radioactive dating to be over 4 billion years old. Plenty of time for evolution. The source of variation was explained by mutation. Random changes in DNA that provided new genetic material for selection to act on. The mechanisms of heredity were clarified by the discovery of DNA's structure in 1953 by James Watson and Francis Crick, building on Rosalind Franklin's X-ray crystallography work. DNA was the molecule of heredity. Genes were sequences of DNA that coded for proteins, and mutations were changes in DNA sequence. Molecular biology provided even stronger evidence for evolution. When biologists could finally compare DNA sequences directly, they found that the patterns of similarity matched evolutionary relationships predicted from anatomy and fossils. Humans were most similar to other great apes, less similar to other primates, less still to other mammals, but sharing recognizable genes with all life. The unity of life at the molecular level was striking. All organisms used the same genetic code, with rare exceptions. This universality pointed to common ancestry. Molecular clocks, comparisons of DNA or protein sequences to estimate when species diverged, gave evolution a timeline. Though imperfect, these clocks generally agreed with fossil dates and with evolutionary relationships inferred from anatomy. Everything fit together. The convergence of evidence from geology, paleontology, comparative anatomy, embryology, biogeography, genetics, and molecular biology all pointing to the same tree of life, the same pattern of common descent with modification, was overwhelming. Darwin's theory, once radical and incomplete, had matured into the central organizing principle of biology. Theodosius Dobzhansky captured this in his famous 1973 essay, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." Evolution wasn't just a theory among many. It was the framework that made sense of all biological observations. Why did organisms have the structures they did? Because of their evolutionary history. Why did species show certain patterns of distribution? Because of evolution and biogeography. Why did DNA sequences show patterns of similarity? Because of common descent. Evolution explained everything, and yet the modern synthesis was itself not the end of the story. Science continues to advance, and evolutionary theory continues to evolve. Discoveries of how genes are regulated, how development shapes evolution, how organisms can inherit more than just DNA sequences, all these have added nuance and complexity to our understanding. But the core Darwinian insight remains unchanged and unchallenged. Life evolves through descent with modification, shaped by natural selection acting on heritable variation. Darwin was fundamentally right. Evolution today. Darwin's living legacy. 166 years after the publication of On the Origin of Species, evolution is no longer a hypothesis or even just a theory in the colloquial sense. It's the foundation of modern biology, as well established as any scientific fact, supported by multiple independent lines of evidence that all converge on the same conclusion. But evolution isn't just history. It's an ongoing process happening all around us. And evolutionary biology is a vibrant, active field of research, making new discoveries that continue to deepen our understanding of life. One of the most exciting developments is the ability to observe evolution in real time, watching it happen on timescales much faster than Darwin imagined. We've already mentioned the Grant's finch studies and the evolution of antibiotic resistance, but there are many other examples. HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, evolves so rapidly that within a single patient, the virus population diversifies and adapts, evolving resistance to drugs. This is why combination therapy, attacking the virus with multiple drugs simultaneously, is necessary. The virus can evolve resistance to one drug, but is unlikely to simultaneously evolve resistance to several. Fruit flies in laboratories have been subjected to artificial selection experiments for over 100 years. Researchers have successfully selected for increased lifespan, larger body size, faster development, resistance to toxins, and many other traits, demonstrating empirically how selection shapes populations. Some of these selection experiments have run for hundreds of generations, providing case studies in how evolution works. In nature, evolution sometimes happens startlingly fast. The Italian wall lizards, introduced to a small island in the Adriatic, evolved noticeable changes in just 36 years, developing larger heads and different digestive systems as they adapted to a new diet. Three-spined sticklebacks in freshwater lakes have repeatedly evolved from marine ancestors, losing their bony armor and developing different body shapes in just a few thousand years. These rapid evolutionary changes show that evolution isn't always slow and gradual. Given strong selection pressures, populations can evolve quickly. The field of evolutionary developmental biology, or EvoDevo, has revealed how changes in developmental processes can drive evolution. Many evolutionary innovations involve not creating entirely new genes, but modifying when and where existing genes are expressed during development. Relatively small changes in gene regulation can have dramatic effects on adult form. This helps explain how evolution can produce major innovations, and how organisms can share so many genes yet look so different. The discovery of horizontal gene transfer, where organisms can acquire genes from other species rather than just from parents, has complicated the tree of life, especially for microorganisms. Bacteria routinely exchange genetic material, and some of our own genes appear to have viral origins. Evolution is messier and more complex than a simple branching tree suggests, at least for single-celled organisms. But for multicellular eukaryotes like animals and plants, the tree of life remains a good model. Evolutionary medicine is an emerging field applying evolutionary principles to understand health and disease. Why do we get sick? Often because we're fighting an evolutionary arms race with pathogens that evolve to overcome our defenses. Why do we age? Partly because natural selection favors traits that enhance early reproduction, even if they're harmful later in life, when we've already passed on our genes. Why do we crave sugar and fat? Because in our evolutionary past, calories were scarce, and our ancestors who craved energy-dense foods survived better. But in modern environments of plenty, those same cravings contribute to obesity and diabetes. Understanding our evolutionary history helps us understand our biology. Conservation biology relies heavily on evolutionary principles. Understanding how species evolve and adapt helps us predict how they'll respond to changing environments, habitat loss, climate change. Genetic diversity, the raw material for evolution, is crucial for conservation because populations with low diversity lack the variation needed to adapt to new challenges. Evolutionary biology informs breeding programs, habitat management, and strategies for preserving endangered species. Agriculture and animal husbandry are applied evolution. For thousands of years, humans have been conducting artificial selection experiments, domesticating plants and animals, creating varieties tailored to our needs. Modern crop breeding combines traditional selection with genetic engineering, but the goal remains the same: directing evolution to serve human purposes. Understanding evolutionary principles helps breeders work more effectively. Despite this overwhelming evidence and practical application, evolution remains controversial in some circles, particularly in parts of the United States where religious fundamentalism rejects it. This rejection is not based on scientific evidence. No credible scientific evidence contradicts evolution, and virtually all biologists accept it. The controversy is cultural and religious, not scientific. It's driven by a perceived conflict between evolution and certain interpretations of religious texts, particularly literal readings of the Genesis creation account. Common misconceptions about evolution persist even among those who accept it. Evolution doesn't have a goal or direction. It's not progress toward some ideal. humans are not the pinnacle of evolution. We're one branch among millions, successful in our own way, but not objectively superior. Evolution doesn't make organisms perfect. It makes them good enough to survive and reproduce in their environments. Evolution doesn't occur in individuals. Individuals don't evolve, populations do. And evolution is both a fact and a species change over time. Life has a common ancestor, and a theory, the scientific framework explaining how and why evolution occurs. Another misconception is that evolution is just a theory, using theory in the colloquial sense of a guess or speculation. In science, a theory is a well-substantiated explanation of natural phenomena, supported by vast amounts of evidence. Germ theory, atomic theory, and evolutionary theory are all theories in this sense, among the most reliable knowledge we have. Evolution is as much a fact as gravity. We observe it happening, and evolutionary theory explains how it works, just as gravitational theory explains how gravity works. Looking to the future, evolutionary biology continues to ask profound questions. How did life originate? We don't fully know, though we're learning more about how simple chemicals could have assembled into self-replicating molecules billions of years ago. How does complex specified information arise in DNA? Through natural selection favoring mutations that happen to be beneficial, combined with other processes like gene duplication, horizontal transfer, and recombination. Are there universal principles of evolution that might apply even to non-carbon-based life elsewhere in the universe? Possibly. If life exists elsewhere, it likely evolved through some process of variation, inheritance, and selection, though the details might differ wildly from Earth's biology. The scope of evolutionary biology has also expanded to include cultural evolution in humans. Our behaviors, technologies, and ideas change over time through processes that resemble biological evolution. Variation, transmission, selection, language evolves. Technology evolves. Cultural evolution operates on much faster timescales than biological evolution, and follows somewhat different rules, but the underlying logic of descent with modification is similar. Some researchers are developing frameworks for understanding cultural change through an evolutionary lens. Evolutionary theory itself evolves. New discoveries lead to refinements and extensions. But the core Darwin established remains solid. Life evolved. Species are related through common ancestry. Natural selection is a major mechanism shaping that evolution, though not the only one. These insights have stood the test of time and continue to be confirmed by every new line of evidence. Darwin would recognize and approve of modern evolutionary biology even, while being astonished by its sophistication and scope. From medical research to conservation to agriculture to understanding our own nature, evolution is not an abstract theory, but a practical tool and a fundamental truth about the living world. It's the grand unifying theory of biology, the framework that makes sense of life's diversity, complexity, and history. And it all traces back to a man on a ship observing finches and fossils, thinking carefully about what it all meant. and having the courage to follow the evidence where it led. The personal Darwin: life, family, and final years. Behind the towering scientific legacy, Charles Darwin was a person, a husband, a father, a chronic invalid, a man who experienced joy and grief, doubt and conviction, who lived a particular life in a particular time and place. Understanding Darwin. The person enriches our understanding of Darwin the scientist and reminds us that great ideas come from human beings with all their complexity and contradictions. Darwin married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, in January 1839, just 2 years after his return from the Beagle Voyage. Emma was the daughter of Josiah Wedgwood II, Darwin's uncle who had helped to persuade his father to let him join the Beagle. The marriage was, by all accounts, deeply happy despite some sources of tension. Emma was devoutly religious, and Charles's loss of faith troubled her. She worried for his soul, fearing they might not be reunited in an afterlife if he didn't believe. Darwin knew this and it pained him, but he couldn't believe what he didn't believe. They had 10 children together, 7 of whom survived to adulthood. Their children's names were William, Anne, Mary, Henrietta, George, Elizabeth, Francis, Leonard, Horace, and Charles. Mary died as an infant, and little Charles lived only 2 years. But the most devastating loss was Anne, their second daughter and Darwin's favorite child. Annie died in 1851 at age 10, probably of tuberculosis. Darwin nursed her through her final illness and was with her when she died. The loss shattered him. He wrote a memorial to her, describing her joy, her affection, her vitality, all lost. Annie's death seems to have been the final blow to Darwin's fading Christianity. He couldn't reconcile a benevolent God with such meaningless suffering. The surviving Darwin children were accomplished. George became an astronomer. Francis and Horace became scientists, continuing their father's botanical work. Leonard became an army officer and later a prominent eugenicist, a dark chapter in the Darwin legacy. William became a banker. Henrietta remained at home, helping her father with his work and later editing his autobiography. The Darwin household was lively, full of children and animals, dogs and cats and pigeons. Darwin was an affectionate, if somewhat absent-minded father, often absorbed in his work but doting when engaged. Charles and Emma settled at Down House in Kent in 1842, when Charles was 33. This would be his home for the rest of his life, 40 years. Down House was a large but not grand country house, surrounded by gardens where Darwin would conduct his experiments. He established a strict routine, working in his study in the morning, walking the sandwalk, a path around the property that he called his thinking path, resting in the afternoon, working again briefly, then spending the evening with family, listening to Emma play piano or having Emma or Henrietta read novels to him while he lay on the sofa. Darwin's chronic illness shaped his daily life profoundly. The illness began shortly after his return from the Beagle Voyage and plagued him for the rest of his life. Symptoms included severe gastrointestinal distress, vomiting, headaches, heart palpitations, and exhaustion. He could work only a few hours a day, often had to lie down, and avoided social engagements because he couldn't predict when symptoms would strike. This illness has never been definitively diagnosed. Chagas disease, contracted from a bite by a great black bug of the pampas in South America, is one possibility. Lactose intolerance, psychosomatic stress related to the controversial nature of his work, chronic fatigue syndrome, Meniere's disease, all have been proposed. We may never know. Whatever the cause, the illness was a defining feature of Darwin's life. It limited him, confined him to Down House, made him reliant on Emma's care. But it also, paradoxically, may have helped his work. The illness forced him to focus his limited energy on essential work. He couldn't dissipate his efforts in social activities or travel. Everything had to matter, had to advance his scientific projects. And because he couldn't attend scientific meetings or maintain an active social life in London, he conducted his scientific work through correspondence, writing thousands of letters to colleagues around the world, gathering data, testing ideas, building networks. This correspondence became one of his greatest assets. Darwin was also a man of contradictions. He was radical in his science but conventional in his politics and social views. He opposed slavery vehemently and was appalled by the racism he witnessed on his travels. Yet he shared many Victorian prejudices about women's inferiority and European superiority, though he opposed using evolution to justify these prejudices. He was gentle and kind in personal relationships, but could be ruthless in scientific arguments. He was plagued by self-doubt, yet confident enough to revolutionize biology. He was sickly, yet immensely productive, publishing major books throughout his life despite chronic illness. In his later years, Darwin became increasingly famous. His books sold well. Evolution was accepted by the scientific establishment, and he was honored with medals and memberships in prestigious societies. He received the Royal Society's Copley Medal, their highest award. Universities offered him honorary degrees. Visitors came to Down House to meet the great naturalist, though Darwin often had to decline due to illness. He continued working until the end, his last book on earthworms published the year before his death. Darwin died on April 19, 1882, at age 73 at Down House. His last words were reportedly to Emma, "I am not the least afraid of death." The immediate cause of death was a heart attack, though his long illness had weakened him. The family initially planned to bury him in the village churchyard at Down, but a campaign arose to honor him with burial at Westminster Abbey. Leading scientists and politicians petitioned for this honor, and the family agreed. On April 26th, Darwin was buried in Westminster Abbey, near Isaac Newton, and just a few feet from John Herschel, a polymath Darwin admired. The pallbearers included Thomas Henry Huxley, Joseph Hooker, and Alfred Russel Wallace, his closest scientific allies. It was a state funeral in all but name, recognizing Darwin as one of Britain's greatest minds. The man who challenged Orthodox Christianity was laid to rest in the nation's most sacred Christian space. The irony was noted by many, but it also symbolized something important. By the end of his life, Darwin's ideas, while still controversial to some, were recognized as a profound contribution to human knowledge, worthy of the highest honor. Emma outlived Charles by 14 years, dying in 1916 at age 88. She maintained Down House much as it had been during Charles's life, preserving his study, his collections, his library. Today, Down House is a museum, open to visitors, a shrine to Darwin's memory, and a testament to the power of careful observation, patient thought, and the courage to follow evidence even when it challenges our deepest assumptions about ourselves and our place in the world. Closing, our place in the story. And so we come to the end of our journey through Darwin's theory of evolution. We've traveled from a young man boarding a ship with uncertain prospects to a scientist whose ideas reshaped humanity's understanding of life. We've explored the mechanisms of natural selection, the evidence from fossils and finches, from DNA and development, from islands and laboratories. We've seen how Darwin's insights were initially controversial but became foundational, how they've been refined and extended but never refuted, how they remain as essential to biology today as they were revolutionary in 1859. But what does it all mean? What does evolution tell us about ourselves, about our place in the world, about the nature of existence? These are profound questions, and Darwin grappled with them throughout his life. In some ways, evolution stripped away comforting illusions. We are not the center of creation, not specially designed, not fundamentally separate from other animals. We are part of nature, products of the same processes that shape beetles and barnacles, descended from apes, from earlier mammals, from reptiles, from fish, ultimately from single cells that arose billions of years ago in ancient seas. We are not fallen angels, but risen apes. This can feel diminishing. If we're just animals, products of blind natural processes, where does meaning come from? Where does morality come from? If there's no grand designer, no ultimate purpose, no cosmic plan, what are we to make of our lives? These are questions Darwin struggled with, especially after losing his faith. He found meaning not in divine purpose but in the wonder of life itself, in the intricate connections between organisms, in the beauty of natural processes, in the joy of discovery and understanding. And there is profound wonder in the evolutionary perspective. Consider that every living thing on Earth is related, that all of us, humans and hummingbirds, mushrooms and maples, bacteria and blue whales, share common ancestors if you go back far enough. We are literally family, all branches on the same tree of life. The atoms in your body were forged in ancient stars. The genes in your cells descended from the first self-replicating molecules. The adaptations that allow you to think and feel and wonder are the product of billions of years of evolution. You are a continuation of an unbroken chain reaching back to the origin of life, a temporary configuration of matter that has been shaped by deep time into something capable of contemplating its own existence. Evolution also teaches humility. We are not the pinnacle of creation, not the goal toward which life has been striving. We're one twig on a vastly branching tree, successful in our way but not objectively superior. Every species alive today is equally evolved, has been shaped by the same deep history, has adaptations as remarkable as our own. A bacteria has had just as many generations of ancestors as we have, just as much evolutionary history. The complexity of a human brain is wondrous, but so is the wing of a butterfly, the echolocation of a bat, the camouflage of an octopus, the photosynthesis of a leaf. Life found countless solutions to the challenges of existence, countless forms and strategies, and none is the right one. They're all experiments in the art of survival, and we're just one among many. Yet there is also something precious about humanity from an evolutionary perspective. We are, as far as we know, the only species that understands evolution, that can contemplate our own origins, that can piece together the history of life from fossils and genes and comparative anatomy. We are the universe contemplating itself, the cosmos grown conscious and curious. Evolution has given rise to minds capable of science, art, philosophy, love, of asking questions like, where do we come from? And why are we here? And actually finding answers. That seems worthy of awe. Evolution also reveals that adaptation is not about perfection, but about survival and reproduction. The crooked path of the recurrent laryngeal nerve, the backward-wired retina, the vestigial tailbone, these imperfections remind us that we are products of history, built from what came before, carrying evolutionary baggage. This makes us more interesting, not less. We bear in our bodies the marks of our ancestry, connections to the deep past. We are living fossils, in a sense, ancient designs modified for modern purposes. Understanding evolution changes how we see the world. A walk through a forest becomes a journey through evolutionary relationships and adaptations. Why does that tree have those particular leaf shapes? What pollinators is that flower trying to attract? How are these mushrooms related to those ones? Why do these birds sing? Every organism is a collection of solutions to evolutionary problems. Every interaction between species a chapter in an ongoing co-evolutionary story. The world becomes richer, more interconnected, more comprehensible. Evolution is also a reminder of constant change. Species are not fixed. They're always evolving, always responding to changing environments, always in flux. The world we see today is a snapshot in an ongoing process. The species around us will continue to evolve, and so will we, though our technological control of our environment has changed the selection pressures we face. Evolution doesn't stop. It can't stop as long as there's reproduction, variation, and selection. Life will continue to experiment, to branch, to adapt, to surprise us with new forms and solutions. And evolution is still happening in us. Human cultural evolution operates on timescales much faster than biological evolution. But our genes are still changing too, responding to new environments, new diets, new diseases. We're not finished products, but works in progress. And what we become in the future, if we survive, may be as different from us as we are from our Pleistocene ancestors. Darwin's theory also reminds us of interconnectedness. Every species depends on others, in food webs, in pollination, and seed dispersal, in decomposition and nutrient cycling. The extinctions we cause through habitat destruction ripple through ecosystems in unpredictable ways. We are not separate from nature, but embedded in it, dependent on it, shaped by it. Damaging the web of life, damages ourselves. There's a deep beauty in evolutionary theory, an elegance in how simple principles generate such complexity and diversity. From variation, inheritance, and selection, from these three ingredients plus time, all the richness of life emerges. No miracles needed, no violations of natural law, just nature following its course, matter and energy organizing into ever more complex patterns, until something like us emerges, capable of understanding the very process that created us. Darwin gave us a gift, a way of understanding ourselves and all life that is naturalistic, yet filled with wonder, scientific, yet deeply meaningful. We are part of an ancient story still being written, a story billions of years old and stretching into an unknown future. We are connected to all of life, related to every organism, shaped by the same forces, subject to the same principles. And we are capable, for a brief moment in cosmic time, of understanding how it all works, of piecing together our own origin story, of seeing ourselves clearly as the products of natural processes operating over deep time. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can hold this thought. You are evolution made conscious. Your existence is not an accident, but an outcome, a result of uncounted generations of ancestors who survived long enough to reproduce, whose genes made it through the filter of selection, who passed something forward that eventually became you. You carry their legacy in every cell, in every gene, in adaptations for seeing and hearing and thinking that took millions of years to refine. You are a temporary pattern in the flow of life, here for a while, part of the ongoing story. And if you've enjoyed this gentle exploration of Darwin's theory of evolution, if it's helped you see the world a bit differently, or given you something to wonder about as you drift to sleep, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Sleepy Science Society. It helps others discover these stories, these explorations of the great ideas that have shaped our understanding of the universe and ourselves. Sleep well. Dream of ancient seas and rising mountains, of finches adapting to drought, of trees of life branching across billions of years, of the long, patient, beautiful process that made you. And know that you are part of something vast and wonderful, a story that connects you to every living thing, a dance of variation and selection that has been going on since the first cells divided in primordial oceans, and that will continue long after you've returned your atoms to the earth from which they came. Good night.